The morning sun rose slow and heavy over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in gold and red. Dust hung in the air, shimmering like smoke as wagons rolled through the trading post road. It was one of those mornings when the wind carried the scent of dry earth and wood smoke, and everyone seemed to move slower, waiting for the heat to build. At the center of the small town stood a few wooden buildings, an old trading post, a stable, a blacksmith shed, and a row of tents where travelers rested before heading west. The air was quiet, broken only by the sound of boots crunching on gravel and horses shifting their weight. But that peace did not last long. A shout cut through the stillness. People turned their heads toward the road that led from the open desert. A group of men on horseback appeared, their faces hard and sunburned. Behind them came a wagon, the wheels throwing up clouds of dust. And walking beside it, stumbling more than walking, was a young Apache woman. Her hands were bound in front of her, tied to a short length of chain fixed to the wagon's side. Her dress was torn at the edge, her dark hair full of dust, her face streaked with the dry sweat of the desert. She was barefoot and her steps were uneven, but she held her head high, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if refusing to see the faces watching her. The men leading the wagon spoke loudly, almost laughing, trying to make a show of what they were doing. One of them, a tall man with a worn hat and sharp blue eyes, shouted toward the crowd. "Caught her sneaking near the corral," said she was after a horse, thought she could get away with it. The people around the trading post didn't know what to say. Some stepped back, others whispered to one another. A few shook their heads but stayed silent. They had seen things like this before. The border between settlers and the Apache lands was full of tension. Every small theft, every rumor was enough to cause anger and fear on both sides. The young woman didn't speak. She didn't fight. She walked quietly beside the wagon, the chain rattling softly each time the wheels turned. Her eyes stayed calm as though she was far away in her mind, somewhere beyond the shouts and stares. At the edge of the crowd, an old man who ran the trading post came out of his doorway. He had seen many kinds of trouble pass through his town, and his face showed it. He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped closer. "Where are you taking her?" he asked the man in the hat. The man laughed. "We'll hand her to the fort. Let the soldiers decide what to do. Maybe they'll make an example of her." The trader frowned. "She's just one person. Maybe she was looking for food." "Food," another man barked. "You think that's a reason to sneak into a settler's land? They steal, they raid, they burn, and you want to feed them?" The trader sighed and stepped back. He wanted to speak again but didn't. The desert had taught him something. Some days words only brought more trouble. As the wagon moved forward, the woman stumbled on a loose stone and fell to her knees. The chain went tight and the wagon jerked to a stop. She lifted herself up again slowly, her face calm but her breathing heavy. The men on horseback didn't help her. They only told her to keep walking. The sun rose higher, beating down on the open road. The dust grew thicker. Even the horses looked tired. The few women who had come out of their homes to see what was happening whispered among themselves. One young mother pulled her child close and turned away, unable to watch. Across the road at the far end of town, a man stood beside his horse, watching quietly. He was tall with a sun-faded coat and a wide hat that cast a shadow across his face. His name was Elias McCord, a rancher who lived a few miles west of town. Elias had come that morning only to buy some supplies, nails, flour, a bit of salt, maybe a new rope. He didn't plan on getting involved in anyone else's business. He rarely did, but as he watched the scene unfolding, something inside him stirred, a kind of deep, quiet anger that he hadn't felt in years. He had seen things like this before, long ago, during the war. People treated unfairly, judged without proof, hurt because they belonged to the wrong side. He thought he had left those memories behind when he came west to start over, but now they came rushing back. He noticed the young woman's hands. Despite the dust, he could see that her wrists were marked where the rope rubbed against her skin. Her steps were slow but steady, and she didn't once look down. That pride, silent and unbroken, caught his attention. A few boys ran alongside the road, laughing because they didn't understand what was really happening. One of the men told them to clear off, and they did. The sound of the wagon's creaking wheels filled the air again. Elias's horse shifted its weight, snorting softly. He laid a hand on the animal's neck, eyes never leaving the woman. Something about the whole scene felt wrong, deeply wrong, He looked around, at the people standing by, at the ones pretending to be busy. No one moved to help her. The old trader caught Elias's eyes across the street and gave him a helpless shrug. It was a small gesture, but it told Elias everything. No one was going to stop it. Not the townsfolk, not the law. Everyone was too afraid of making enemies. The wagon reached the edge of the trading post. The men joked among themselves, saying they'd stop at the next stream to rest the horses. One of them took a long drink from his canteen, poured a little water over his hat, and looked back at the woman as if she were just another burden to haul across the desert. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He looked at the sun, already climbing high, and then back at her. The distance between them was no more than 50 feet, but it felt wider, like a canyon filled with everything wrong in the world. The wind picked up, stirring the dust into little spirals that danced across the road. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. The sound echoed in the silence that followed the men's laughter. Elias stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground. His horse followed beside him, quiet and calm. He walked until he reached the edge of the street where the road widened into open land again. The wagon was moving slow, the woman still walking beside it, head bent slightly against the glare of the sun. He could hear the chain clinking, soft but steady, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something he didn't yet understand. Behind him, a few of the townsfolk watched him go. The old trader called out softly, "Elias, let it be. It's not your fight." But Elias didn't answer. He just kept walking toward the road. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do. He didn't have a plan, didn't even have anger enough to shout. He only knew one thing, that what he saw was wrong and someone had to say it out loud. The desert sun burned hotter now. Sweat trickled down his neck, but he didn't stop. Ahead of him, the men were getting ready to move faster, and if he didn't act soon, the moment would pass, and so would his chance to make it right. He stopped beside his horse, tightening the strap on the saddle. The reins felt warm in his hands. He looked once more at the woman, still walking quietly through the dust, her shadow long and thin beside the wagon wheel. In that instant, something inside him settled. He couldn't change the whole world, but he could change this moment. He took a deep breath, swung into the saddle, and nudged his horse forward. The crowd turned their heads as he started toward the road, slow and steady, like a man who had made up his mind. The wagon moved on, the men unaware that the quiet rancher had decided to stand in their way, and somewhere behind him, the old trader whispered under his breath, "Lord help him, he's going to do it." The sun kept climbing, the desert holding its breath. What happened next would be remembered in that little town for years. The road shimmered under the desert sun, a thin line of heat stretching between the wagon and the quiet man who followed behind. Elias rode at a slow pace, the sound of his horse's hooves soft on the dry ground. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply watched. The group of men up ahead hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy talking among themselves, laughing as they moved along the trail. The wagon's wheels creaked and groaned. The young Apache woman still walked beside it, her steps slower now, her shoulders bent from the weight of the long road. The sun had climbed high above them, and the air shimmered with heat. The desert stretched on forever, rolling sand, sharp rocks, and the faint blue of distant hills. There wasn't a tree in sight, no shade, no cool wind, only the dry whisper of the land itself. Elias knew these lands well. He'd ridden through every mile between the post and the San Pedro River. He knew where the waterholes were, where the wild horses grazed, and where the Apache families sometimes camped in the canyons. He had never had trouble with them. They traded with him sometimes, small things, meat for salt, beads for tools. He never saw them as enemies, just people trying to live. He rode a little closer, and the men finally turned and saw him. The tall one with the worn hat shaded his eyes with his hand. "What's your business, rancher?" he called out. Elias didn't answer right away. He guided his horse nearer until he was close enough to see the chain glinting in the sunlight. The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no fear in them, only a deep tiredness, the kind that comes from too many hard days. He looked back at the men. "You plan to walk her all the way to the fort?" he asked calmly. The man in the hat nodded. "That's right. The captain wants to make sure folks around here know what happens to thieves." "Was she caught stealing?" Elias asked. The man shrugged. Someone saw her near a corral. That's enough for me. Elias looked down for a moment as if weighing his words carefully. You have any proof? The man's smile faded. You calling me a liar? No, Elias said, his voice even. I'm saying you don't punish people without knowing for sure. The others on horseback shifted uncomfortably. One of them, younger than the rest, looked at the woman and then away again, uneasy. Another man muttered something under his breath, but no one laughed this time. The road had gone quiet except for the buzz of flies and the creak of the wagon wheels. The heat made the air shimmer between them like a thin veil of glass. Elias moved his horse closer. He could see now that the woman's wrists were raw from the rough rope tied to the chain. Her lips were dry, cracked from the sun. She swayed slightly, trying to steady herself. Untie her, Elias said softly. The man in the hat narrowed his eyes. You best keep riding, friend. This isn't your concern. Elias didn't move. It became my concern when I saw it. A murmur went through the group. The younger man shifted in his saddle. He's right, Jack, he said to the leader. She's been walking since sunrise. We could at least let her ride. Jack glared at him. You going soft too? The younger man dropped his eyes. No, sir. Elias sat still on his horse, one hand resting on the saddle horn. He looked at Jack with the steady patience of someone who had learned to speak only when it mattered. You've made your point, he said. Everyone in town saw what you wanted them to see. Now it's time to stop. Jack laughed, but the sound was forced. You planning to stop me, rancher? Elias shook his head slowly. I'm asking you. Jack dismounted, his boots raising a small puff of dust. He walked toward Elias, stopping just short of the horse's nose. His expression was tight, like a man trying to prove something he wasn't sure about. You've got a quiet mouth, McCord, he said. I've heard of you. The man who lives out by the West Ridge, alone with his cows. Folks say you don't talk much. Maybe that's for the best. Elias looked down at him. Maybe it is. But today I'm talking. Jack's hand twitched toward the rope on the wagon. The other men watched, unsure of what to do. The young one looked ready to speak again, but didn't. The air felt thick. Even the horses stood still, their ears flicking at flies. Elias leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his tone quiet but firm. You call yourself a man of the law, but laws don't come from cruelty. If she did wrong, she can face a fair hearing. But you're not judge or jury. You're just angry. And that's not justice. Jack looked away, his jaw working. He didn't like being spoken to like that, especially not in front of the others. But something in Elias's calmness made it hard to answer with pride. Finally, he turned to the woman. You hear that? He said sharply. You've got a friend now. The woman didn't reply. She just stood quietly, her breathing shallow, her gaze steady on the road. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots touching the dry earth. He stepped toward the wagon, his voice gentle. You can rest now, he said to her. Jack raised his hand as if to stop him, but Elias didn't look at him. He untied the end of the chain where it was fastened to the wagon. The sound of the metal links falling to the ground was soft, but in that silence it felt louder than thunder. The woman rubbed her wrists slowly, blinking against the sunlight. She didn't speak or smile, but she lifted her chin slightly, a small sign of dignity returning. Jack watched, his face dark with frustration. You're making a mistake, he said. Elias turned to him. Maybe, but I'll live with it. The younger man shifted again, clearly relieved that someone had done what he didn't have the courage to do himself. She needs water, he said quietly. Elias nodded. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to the woman. She drank slowly, careful not to spill a drop. Then she looked at him again, her dark eyes full of something unspoken. Thanks, perhaps, or surprise that a stranger had chosen kindness. Jack looked at the other men. None of them met his eyes. The power he had a few minutes ago seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. Fine, he said finally. You take her, McCord. But don't come asking for help when they come looking for you. Elias didn't answer. He just guided the woman toward his horse and helped her climb up behind him. She moved stiffly, her body weak from the long walk. He waited until she was seated, then mounted in front of her, steadying the reins. As he turned his horse toward the west, Jack called after him, You'll regret this. Elias didn't look back. He simply said, I've regretted worse things than mercy. The wagon stood still for a long time after he left, the men uncertain of what had just happened. The dust from Elias's horse slowly settled, leaving the road quiet once again. The sun began to drop lower, painting the desert with orange light. In the distance, Elias and the woman rode toward the low hills, their shadows long on the sand. For the first time that day, the wind felt cooler. At the trading post, the old man who had watched from afar whispered to himself, "That quiet rancher, he did it. He actually did it." Back on the open trail, Elias said nothing. He didn't know her story yet, and she didn't have the strength to tell it. But he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes it took only one person to remind the world what it meant to be human. The horse's steady rhythm carried them west. Away from the noise, away from the cruelty, toward a small ranch where kindness still had a place to rest. The desert sky deepened into gold, then rose, then violet. As night came, a faint light appeared, Elias's lantern glowing warm in the dark, a promise that for now she was safe. And somewhere in the silence, far beyond the horizon, the world felt just a little less cruel. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the desert. The heat of the day lingered, but the wind carried a soft relief, brushing against the faces of those who traveled along the open trail. Elias guided his horse steadily, the young Apache woman behind him. Her body was still weak from the long morning, but she had the quiet strength of someone who had endured far too much. She did not speak, but she pressed her hands gently against the saddle, holding herself upright. Elias could feel the tension in her body, the way she seemed ready to flinch at any sound. He had seen fear before, but this was different. This was the kind of fear that came from knowing the world could be cruel without reason, and that even small acts of mercy could feel too late. They rode in silence for several miles, the desert around them vast and empty. Only the faint sound of the horse's hooves and the occasional caw of a distant crow broke the quiet. Elias kept glancing over his shoulder, aware that someone might come after them. The men from the wagon might not have liked what he had done, and there was always the fort to consider. At one point, the woman shifted slightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice low and careful. Elias nodded but said nothing. Words were not needed yet. Trust had to grow slowly, especially after the morning she had endured. They reached a small dry stream where a few tufts of grass marked the edge of life in the harsh landscape. Elias guided the horse to a small patch of shade, cast by a lone mesquite tree, and allowed her to slide carefully to the ground. She winced as her feet touched the hot sand, but she held herself steady. "I'll give you a moment to rest," Elias said quietly. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. She drank slowly, letting the cool water ease the dryness of her throat. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon as if making sure they were truly alone, that no one from the fort had followed them. Where are we going?" she asked finally, her voice still soft, almost hesitant. "To my ranch," Elias replied. "Not far from here. You'll be safe there for the night." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. They could have hurt me." Her words were careful, almost as if speaking aloud might bring the danger back. "They didn't," Elias said firmly, "and they won't. Not while I'm here." For a few miles they rode again, the desert changing subtly around them. The hills rose higher and small clusters of cactus and scrub grew between the rocks. Elias's mind wandered to what might come next. He knew that the fort would be upset. Soldiers did not like being challenged, especially by someone who lived quietly on the edge of town, but he also knew that what he had done was right. That was more important than fear of consequences. As they approached the ranch, the outline of a small wooden house came into view. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the soft sound of a dog barking echoed across the field. Elias guided the horse carefully down the narrow path, letting the woman slip from the saddle once more. Inside the house, a warm fire burned, casting a comforting glow across the room. Elias's housekeeper, Martha, had prepared a simple meal of bread, beans, and dried meat. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the young woman. "You're safe here," Elias said to her, his voice steady. "Rest, eat, drink." Martha nodded, bringing a bowl of water and a plate of food. The young woman sat quietly, accepting the meal without hesitation. She ate slowly, her hand still trembling slightly, but with each bite she seemed to regain some of her strength. Elias sat across from her, keeping his eyes on the doorway. He could feel the weight of what might come. The fort would know soon. Jack and his men would report him, and he would be called to account. He had faced soldiers before, but never like this. Never to defend someone else's life so directly. As the sun dipped lower, the desert outside turned shades of orange and purple. The wind carried the faint sound of distant cattle and the occasional cry of a hawk returning to its nest. Elias took a deep breath, letting the quiet calm him. Finally, the young woman spoke again. Why did you help me?" Elias looked at her, his expression soft but firm. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Someone has to stand when others turn away. It may not be brave. It may not be easy, but it's the right choice." She considered his words carefully. I have never met someone like you," she said. "Someone who would—" "Stop them," Elias shrugged lightly. "I've seen enough cruelty to know that it leaves its mark. You didn't deserve that, and no one should have to carry it alone." They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the wind moving through the small cracks in the wooden walls. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the room. The young woman's eyes, once wary and fearful, began to show a faint glimmer of trust. Outside, the night was deepening. Stars appeared in the sky, bright and countless, the desert quiet but alive. Elias knew the soldiers would not give up so easily. Reports would be made, and he might have to face them in the morning. But for now, the woman was safe, and that mattered more than any threat from the fort. Over the next hour, they spoke quietly. She told him her name, Taza, and little else. The story of her life was painful, but she shared it in fragments, only what she was ready to reveal. She had family in the hills, and though life had been hard, she had survived through resilience and careful choices. Elias listened, never interrupting, simply offering a steady presence. Martha brought another blanket for her, and Taza accepted it gratefully. She curled up on the small bed in the corner, finally letting herself relax. For the first time that day, she seemed almost at peace. Elias remained near the fire, thinking about what tomorrow might bring. The fort would act. Jack and his men would not forgive this interruption. He would be called to justify himself, perhaps even face punishment. But he also knew something important. Standing for what is right often comes with challenges, and sometimes the only thing that matters is that you do not turn away. The night passed quietly, the desert stretching endlessly beyond the small walls of the ranch. Outside, the animals slept, and the wind whispered through the scrub and cactus. Taza slept soundly, her breathing steady, and Elias finally allowed himself to rest. When he closed his eyes, he thought about the road, about the wagon, and about the small acts of courage that can change the course of a day, or even a life. He knew that the morning would bring new challenges, but for now, the woman behind him was safe. That was enough. And in that quiet, under the stars of the Arizona desert, a sense of hope began to grow. One small act, one quiet choice had shifted the course of the day. The desert was harsh. The world could be cruel. But kindness, firm, unwavering, and courageous, could leave a mark stronger than fear. The next morning came quietly. A thin layer of mist hung over the desert, and the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft pink and gold. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush. At the small ranch, everything seemed peaceful. The sound of the windmill turning slowly, the horses moving lazily in their pen, and the faint crackle of the fire that had burned through the night. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his coffee steaming in the early chill. The land stretched endlessly before him, calm and still. Yet behind that calm, he could feel a shadow of worry. He knew the fort would have heard by now. The soldiers were not the type to forget being defied. Inside, Taza was awake. She sat near the fire, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Her face looked softer in the morning light, no longer tight with fear. She had slept deeply for the first time in days. Martha moved quietly around the kitchen, slicing bread and warming water for tea. Elias turned from the open land and stepped back inside. "You should eat something," he said gently. "We'll need to plan what comes next." Taza nodded. "You think they will come?" Elias looked down, then met her eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "Men like that don't let things go easily. But you don't need to be afraid. They'll have to go through me first." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why he cared so much. "You could have walked away yesterday," she said softly. "I could have," Elias agreed. "But then I'd have to live with it." They ate in silence after that, each lost in thought. The peace of the morning stretched for a while, almost convincing Elias that maybe, just maybe, they'd be left alone. But by mid-morning a sound broke that fragile calm, the distant rhythm of horses. Martha looked up sharply. "You hear that?" Elias set down his cup. The sound was faint at first, like a far-off drumbeat, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. He walked out to the porch again and shaded his eyes against the sun. Coming from the east, he saw them, 5 riders kicking up a trail of dust behind them. Their uniforms were easy to spot even from afar. The soldiers from the fort. Taza rose from her seat, her face pale. "They've come for me." Elias turned back to her, his voice calm but firm. "No, they've come for me. You stay inside. No matter what you hear, you stay quiet." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the edge of the blanket. "They will not listen to you." "Maybe not," Elias said, "but I'll make them hear me." As the riders approached, Elias walked down the steps of the porch, standing tall and steady. The desert wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint scent of dust and sage. The leader of the group, a captain with a sharp jaw and neatly pressed uniform, slowed his horse and stopped a few feet away. "Elias McCord?" he called. Elias nodded. "That's me." The captain dismounted, his boots landing hard on the ground. He was a younger man, but his eyes carried the weight of authority. "You interfered with a military transport yesterday. You released a prisoner under guard. You understand that's against the law?" Elias didn't flinch. "What I saw wasn't law," he said evenly. "It was cruelty." The captain's eyes narrowed. "She was accused of theft." "Accused," Elias repeated. "Not proven. And even if she had stolen something, there are ways to handle it that don't involve humiliation." The other soldiers shifted in their saddles. Uncertain, none of them spoke. The captain's gaze stayed fixed on Elias, measuring him. "Where is she?" he asked finally. Elias folded his arms. "Resting. I'll need to speak with her." "She's not well," Elias said. "She's been through enough. You can talk to me instead." The captain studied him for a long moment. "You understand, McCord, you're putting yourself between a prisoner and the government. That's not something you can just walk away from." Elias met his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe not, but I'll stand by it." The captain walked a few paces closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. His voice softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "You seem like a reasonable man. You've got a ranch, a quiet life. Don't ruin it for something that isn't your fight." Elias shook his head slowly. "It became my fight the moment I saw it. What's right doesn't stop being right because it's inconvenient." The words hung in the air, carried by the wind. Behind the captain, one of the younger soldiers, a freckled boy barely out of his teens, looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his saddle and finally spoke. "Sir, she didn't look dangerous. Maybe she just wandered too close." The captain shot him a look that silenced him immediately, but the thought had already taken root. The men glanced at one another, uncertain now. Elias could see the hesitation, the small cracks forming in their confidence. He didn't raise his voice or move closer. He just stood there steady and sure. Finally, the captain sighed. "If you're wrong, McCord, it'll be your name on the report." Elias nodded. "Then I'll live with that." The captain turned his gaze toward the house. Through the window he could see the shadow of a figure, Taza, watching silently. He frowned but didn't move closer. Something about Elias's calmness made him hesitate. After a long pause, he said, "We'll be back tomorrow. The commander will want to hear your explanation himself." Elias inclined his head. "You know where to find me." The captain mounted his horse again, gave a sharp nod, and led his men back toward the open trail. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the distance until only the wind remained. When the last echo disappeared, Elias turned back toward the house. Martha stood at the door, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "You could have been arrested," she said quietly. "Maybe," Elias replied, brushing the dust from his coat. But they didn't. Inside, Taza was standing near the window. When Elias entered, she met his eyes. "You spoke to them calmly," she said softly. "That's how you reach people," he said. "Not with anger. With truth." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You risked much for me." Elias smiled faintly. "Some risks are worth it." That evening, the ranch felt heavier than usual. The peace had returned, but it was the kind that carried an edge, the silence before another storm. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold. Taza helped Martha prepare supper. She moved more easily now, her strength returning. She even smiled once, a small, fleeting expression, but it was real. Elias noticed, though he pretended not to. He didn't want to make her self-conscious. When night came, he stepped outside again. The stars were bright, scattered like silver dust across the deep blue sky. He stood there for a long time, listening to the desert, feeling the cool breeze on his face. He knew tomorrow would bring questions, maybe more than he wanted to answer. But for now, the woman inside was safe. The ranch was quiet, and the world, for one more night, seemed right again. From inside the house came the faint sound of Taza humming, a low, soft tune that spoke of her people and the lands beyond the hills. It was a song of endurance, of sorrow and hope woven together. Elias closed his eyes and listened. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew that sometimes peace begins with one small act of courage, one moment when someone chooses compassion over fear. And as the stars glowed brighter overhead, Elias McCord stood quietly on his porch, watching the night settle across the desert, ready for whatever morning might bring. The sun rose slowly over the Arizona desert, spilling golden light across the hills and valleys. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth. At the small ranch, everything was quiet, almost peaceful. But Elias knew the calm would not last. The soldiers from the fort would return. The captain had promised that. Inside the house, Taza was awake, moving quietly by the window. She had slept better than the night before, her body finally recovering from the ordeal of being chained and dragged along the road. Her hands were no longer raw, and her eyes, though still wary, held a quiet sense of trust. Martha was preparing breakfast, baking bread over the small stove, stirring a pot of porridge, and humming softly. The sound made the house feel warm, safe, and alive. Elias poured a cup of coffee for himself and leaned against the counter, watching Taza as she watched the horizon. "They will come today," he said gently, though he already knew she could sense it. Taza nodded. "I am not afraid," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You have protected me. That is more than I ever expected." Elias gave a small smile. "You don't need to worry about them. You just stay here. I'll handle it." For several hours, the ranch remained quiet. The only sounds were the wind, moving through the mesquite trees, the soft lowing of cattle, and the occasional call of a distant bird. Elias kept busy, feeding the horses, checking fences, and making sure everything was in order. But his mind was alert, aware that any moment the soldiers could appear over the rise, and then they did. A dust cloud appeared in the distance, small, at first, then growing larger as 5 riders emerged from the trail. The captain led them, his face serious, and the other men followed closely behind. They came at a steady pace, not rushing, as if they were measuring the situation before taking action. Elias walked slowly to the porch, his hands empty and his posture calm. Taza watched from the window, her breath steady but her eyes sharp. Martha stood behind her, quietly watching, unsure of how the morning would unfold. The captain dismounted again and approached Elias. "McCord," he said, his voice steady. "The commander wants an explanation. What happened yesterday? Why did you interfere with a military transport?" Elias met his gaze without hesitation. "I saw a woman treated unfairly. She was accused without proof, chained and dragged along the road. That is not justice. That is cruelty. I could not look away." The captain's eyes narrowed. "And you thought it was your place to decide?" "Yes," Elias replied firmly. "Because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes standing for what is right means taking responsibility. I am responsible for what I did." The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, and Elias could see the hesitation in their eyes. None of them spoke. They had followed orders, but they also saw the truth in his words. The young soldier who had questioned the punishment the day before looked down, uncertain how to respond. The captain studied Elias for a long moment, then sighed. "We will report to the commander. You will need to come with us to explain your actions." Elias nodded. "I will. But first I want you to see her. She is not dangerous. She is human. She deserves respect." The captain hesitated, then nodded. Elias led him to the window where Taza was standing. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes meeting the captain's. She did not bow, nor did she show fear. She simply stood there, quiet but strong, a young woman who had endured much but refused to be broken. The captain glanced at her, then back at Elias. Something in the calmness of the rancher, the quiet dignity of the woman, and the stillness of the land seemed to reach him. He said nothing for a moment, and the silence hung heavily in the air. Finally he spoke. "You saved her from harm, and you have stood your ground. That takes courage. I cannot deny that." Elias nodded. "I only did what was right. That is all." The captain turned to the other soldiers. "We will leave her here. And, McCord, you will come with us to explain your actions to the commander. But understand this. We respect the courage it takes to do what is right. You have made a difficult choice, and you have done it well." Relief washed over Elias, though he did not let it show too much. He guided the captain back toward their horses. Taza watched from the doorway, her hands folded, a small, shy smile on her face. After the soldiers left, the ranch felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had lifted from the air. Elias closed the door behind him and turned to Taza. "It's over," he said softly. "You are safe now." Taza stepped forward and placed her hands gently on his arms. "I cannot thank you enough," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You risked so much for me. You are a rare person." Elias smiled faintly. "The world has its hardships," he said. "But sometimes one small act can make a difference. Today, it did." Martha brought a pot of warm porridge and set it on the table. They all sat together, eating quietly, letting the normalcy of the morning fill the room. For the first time in days, Taza laughed softly at something Martha said, the sound light and free. It was a sound that seemed to echo in the corners of the house, leaving a warmth behind that would not fade quickly. Later in the afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Elias recognized him as the captain returning from the fort, now alone. He dismounted and approached the porch carefully, carrying a folded piece of paper. "McCord," he said, holding it out. "This is the official word from the commander. You are cleared of any wrongdoing. Your actions have been noted as courageous and just. The woman remains under her own choice and protection, and no further pursuit will be made." Elias accepted the paper, reading the words carefully. Relief and quiet satisfaction filled him. "Thank you," he said simply. The captain nodded and mounted his horse. "May the desert continue to be kind to you," he said. With that, he rode off into the hills, leaving only the soft crunch of hooves fading into the distance. Taza turned to Elias, her eyes shining. "They believe me free?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "You are free, and you have a choice now. You can go back to your family or stay here until you are ready to travel. Whatever you decide, it will be your choice alone." For the first time in a long while, Taza felt a sense of hope she had not known in years. She thought of her family in the hills, of the lands she had traveled, and of the life she wanted to live. And she thought of Elias McCord, the quiet rancher who had stood for what was right without fear, without boasting, simply because it was just. Days turned into weeks, and the story of the rancher who had stood against cruelty spread slowly through the small towns and trading posts of the desert. People began to speak of Elias McCord with respect, not only as a rancher but as a man who understood what it meant to protect the vulnerable, to do what is right even when it is hard. Taza stayed at the ranch for several more weeks, regaining her strength and learning the quiet rhythms of ranch life. She helped with chores, fed the animals, and learned from Martha how to bake bread and care for the small garden behind the house. Through it all, Elias treated her not as a guest or someone in need, but as a person with her own dignity and strength. They shared quiet conversations, stories of their lives, and sometimes simply watched the sun rise and set together in companionable silence. When the time came for Taza to return to her family, Elias rode with her to the edge of the hills where her people lived. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just the quiet understanding that some bonds do not need words to be meaningful. "We'll never forget you," Taza said softly, her hands clasped together. "Nor I you," Elias replied. "Take care of yourself. Live boldly, but wisely." She nodded, and with a final glance at the ranch, she disappeared into the hills, her figure merging with the landscape. Elias watched her go, a quiet pride filling his heart. The desert returned to its usual rhythm, the wind over the sand, the call of the hawks, the slow turning of the sun. Yet in the small ranch, there was a lasting warmth, a reminder that courage, kindness, and standing for what is right can leave a mark stronger than fear, stronger than cruelty, and stronger than time itself. Elias returned to the ranch house, stepping onto the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the desert sky in brilliant colors. He looked out over the land he loved, knowing that while challenges would come again, the morning had brought proof that even one quiet person can make a difference. And in the silence of the desert, as the stars began to shimmer above, the story of one young woman and the quiet rancher who chose justice over fear would linger, a reminder to all who heard it that courage and kindness can change lives, even in the harshest of places.